Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the document that's in the modules about not only the different forms of categorical propositions, but also the various valid forms of categorical syllogisms. And so that sheet that's going to talk about the valid forms of categorical syllogisms, will be the one that you need to look at in order to help you along with these problems that I have recorded in the modules. So again, the categorical syllogism are ways in which we determine the validity of certain categorical propositions that are being placed together. So I've given you this example that involves these different forms of categorical propositions, and so we're going to try to determine the validity of this problem. All right. So in order to determine the validity of categorical propositions, we have to do two things. We have to first determine the mood, and the mood here would be the different forms of the categorical proposition. So we need to determine what each one of these propositions are with the form that they have. And remember the A, E, I, O forms of categorical propositions. So we'll determine we'll determine whether these propositions are A, E, I, O, and then we'll put this together, and that will give us the mood. We'll talk about the figure in 1 second. So let's just go ahead and begin by talking about the mood of this syllogism, all right? So again, to think back to the different kinds of propositions, we can really quickly see here that the very first proposition, all marsupials are animals with pouches, is a proposition. And we know this because A propositions, the universal affirmative propositions, all have this, usually begin with this word all, right? It includes everything, right? So we know immediately then that this is an A proposition. Likewise, we can see here on the second proposition, all marsupials are non-placental mammals, that once again we have the all here, so we know that this is a proposition. Again, looking at the conclusion, therefore all animals with pouches are non-placental mammals. Again, we have this all here, so we know that once again that this is going to be an A proposition. So the mood of this syllogism will be characterized as A. Right? Now, in order to determine whether or not this whole thing is valid, we need to figure out the figure of the syllogism. And in order to figure out the figure of the syllogism, we need to locate, first of all, the first step here will be to locate the middle term in the syllogism. Right. Now, again, as the book describes it, the middle term of the syllogism is basically the term that is not included in the conclusion. Right? So it will be the term that is found within the actual individual premises, but not in the conclusion. All right. So therefore, we can see here that we have this term here, marsupials, which is found in premise 1. And again, remember that anything that follows the copula, or the what version of the verb to be, will be the other term here. So we have marsupials here. We have another term, animals with pouches here. Second premise, once again, we see marsupial. And then there's our copula, R. And then here is our second term, non-placental mammals. Well, now we can see then that in the conclusion, marsupials is not included. So in the conclusion, what we have here is animals with pouches. Here's our copula of R, and then non-placental mammals. So here, the term which is included in the premises but not included in the conclusion will be marsupials. So this right here will be our middle term, right? So what we're going to do down here is when it comes to this figure diagram, what we have here is we're just going to put in each of these slots here what the term is. So this representing these two lines representing the first premise, we'll say the middle term, it comes first. And also in the second premise, for this line here, we'll say that the middle term also comes first. All right. So the second point that we'll need to do in order to figure out the mood, or excuse me, the figure of the syllogism is to identify the location of the subject and predicate terms. So we can figure out the subject and predicate by looking at the conclusion. So whatever is going to come before the copula in the conclusion, so animals with pouches, is going to be our subject, whereas anything that comes after the copula in the conclusion will be our predicate. Okay. So now that we know that animals with pouches is the subject in the syllogism, we'll just go find it back in the premises. So we can see here that it's found on premise 1. So knowing that location, we'll say that the subject is the second term in the first premise, and we can go ahead and fill out the conclusion down here. So the subject here, predicate here. Always when you're doing these problems, the conclusion, the two slots that will be filled in will be subject first and then predicate. That's always the case there. So, then we just go back here. Our predicate term is the non-placental mammals bit. We go up here, we find the non-placental mammals bit up in premise 2. That's our predicate. And so then we fill this out here. We fill that slot in with the P. Now, in order to determine whether or not this entire syllogism is valid, now that we know the mood and the figure, you'll need to look back at that document that's in the modules that tells you what are the valid mood and figure combinations, the conditional and unconditionally valid forms. Now, if you look at the document, you will see that what this figure is known as figure 3. Now, if you look at the document, you'll find that figure 3 and the mood of AAA never come together in a valid syllogism. So from that point, we can say that this entire syllogism here is an invalid syllogism. So this is our answer to whether or not this is a valid syllogism. Now, just I want to note very briefly here that in the book, the authors of your book want to use a Venn diagram method. That's fine. That works well if it works for you. I mean, if it's easier for you to conceptualize it that way, that's fine. But typically, it's just easier to memorize the different valid forms of the syllogisms with the mood and the figure. So that's why I'm showing you this particular method as a kind of simpler way of doing these problems.